You don't open a porn website thinking, today I will damage my brain. It starts smaller. Boredom, stress, loneliness, just a few minutes to escape. But over time, something strange happens. The brain begins to want it more, even when you don't. And the question becomes uncomfortable. Why does something that feels good in the moment sometimes leave people feeling empty afterwards? The answer isn't moral, it's neurological. And if you understand what the brain is actually doing, you'll understand something even more important: how people break the cycle. But first, we need to understand why the brain falls into it at all. What is the real problem? Most people think porn consumption is simply about sexual desire, but psychology research shows something different. For many people, it's actually connected to stress relief, emotional escape, loneliness, boredom, curiosity. In psychology, this is called escapism coping. Escapism coping means the brain uses an activity to avoid uncomfortable emotions instead of processing them. So the pattern often looks like this: stress, watch porn, temporary relief. But this relief teaches the brain something powerful. It teaches the brain this is the fastest way to feel better. And once the brain learns that shortcut, it rarely forgets. But the deeper story begins inside the reward system of the brain, the dopamine system, brain mechanism. Inside your brain is a chemical messenger called dopamine. Dopamine is often misunderstood. It's not simply the pleasure chemical, it's actually the motivation chemical. Dopamine tells the brain, this is important, do it again. When someone watches porn, the brain releases dopamine in areas like the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area. These regions form the brain's reward circuit. The same system activates when people eat sugar, win money, or fall in love. But there is one difference. Pornography provides extreme novelty, and novelty has a very powerful effect with dopamine. Psychologists call this phenomenon the Coolidge Effect. The Coolidge Effect describes a biological pattern observed in many mammals. When a new sexual stimulus appears, dopamine spikes again, even if the previous stimulus has lost its excitement. In simple terms, the brain loves novelty, and porn provides unlimited novelty: new videos, new scenarios, new faces. Every click gives the brain another dopamine spike, and over time, the brain starts expecting this level of stimulation. And this leads to the next psychological mechanism: tolerance. Dopamine tolerance. When dopamine spikes repeatedly, the brain adapts. This adaptation is called dopamine tolerance. Tolerance means the brain becomes less sensitive to the same stimulus, so the same content produces less excitement than before. And when that happens, people often look for more novelty, longer viewing sessions, more extreme stimulation. Not because they want to, but because the brain has adjusted its baseline. This is why some researchers compare heavy porn use to behavioral addiction patterns. But addiction is only part of the story. Another powerful mechanism is happening quietly: conditioning. Conditioning is about how the brain learns the habit. Psychologists discovered this mechanism long before the internet existed. It's called classical conditioning. Classical conditioning happens when the brain links two things together repeatedly. For example, phone, porn, dopamine reward. Over time, the brain begins to associate the phone itself with the reward. So eventually, something interesting happens. Just opening a browser or being alone late at night can trigger the urge automatically. Not because the person consciously wants it, but because the brain has learned the cue reward pattern. And when habits reach this stage, something else begins to change: psychology. Psychological impact on the mind. Heavy stimulation doesn't only affect the brain, it can also influence perception and emotions. Some users report desensitization. Desensitization means normal experiences feel less stimulating than before. Real-life intimacy may feel slower, less intense, or less novel compared to digital stimulation. Another psychological effect can be emotional avoidance. Remember the earlier pattern: stress, porn, relief. When this loop repeats frequently, the brain may stop learning healthier ways to process emotions. Instead of dealing with stress, loneliness, or rejection, the brain escapes them. And slowly, the behavior becomes less about pleasure and more about emotional regulation. But here's the important part. The brain is not permanently damaged. It's adaptable. And psychology shows that people can retrain these patterns. But the solution isn't what most people expect. What is the real psychological solution? Many people try to solve the problem with pure willpower. They simply tell themselves, "I will stop." But willpower alone rarely works against conditioned habits. Psychologists focus instead on changing the loop. This approach comes from behavioral psychology. The habit loop has 3 parts: cue, behavior, reward. Instead of fighting the cue, you change the behavior that follows it. For example, stress, exercise; stress, journaling; stress, conversation with a friend. Over time, the brain begins learning a new reward pathway. But there is another powerful psychological tool: Meta-Cognition. Meta-Cognition means becoming aware of your own thoughts and urges. Instead of reacting automatically, you pause and observe the urge. Psychologists sometimes call this technique urge surfing. You notice the urge rising, you watch it, and you let it pass. Research shows urges often peak and fall within 10 to 20 minutes if not acted on. When people practice this repeatedly, the brain slowly weakens the old habit pathway because the reward never arrives. And this reveals something fascinating about the human brain. Habits feel powerful, but they're actually fragile when awareness enters the system. The most important insight is this: porn consumption is rarely only about sex. Often it reflects deeper human experiences: loneliness, stress, curiosity, the need for stimulation, the search for relief from uncomfortable emotions. Understanding these motivations is more useful than shame, because when people understand the psychology, they can paint the pattern. And that leads to a final idea many people miss. The brain isn't broken. It's simply doing what it evolved to do: seeking novelty, seeking reward, avoiding pain. But awareness changes the equation. When you understand how your brain works, you stop fighting yourself, and you start redesigning your habits. Because the brain that learned the pattern is also capable of learning a new one.